Hello and welcome back. It is Bible Scribe, and this video is going to be about the Olivet Discourse. I was going to include this in a subsequent video that I'm making about the time frame references in the New Testament, mainly references to Christ's coming and what they each mean, because there's in some cases a different meaning behind some of these references versus other ones. So it's important to know the context and to know which is which. But the Olivet Discourse is of prime importance. It drives a lot of eschatological beliefs of the preterist system and the historicist system and amillennialism. So we have to be very careful with the Olivet Discourse. In my other video I'm making, the intent is to show that when the coming of Christ is talked about in different cases, either his coming in the clouds or his coming in judgment, all these different ways of saying Christ is coming, it's important to understand the context of the early church, which informs us as to which is being referenced, whether it's the coming in the time of the day of the Lord, which would have been partially fulfilled in 70 AD, or whether it's talking about the future coming of Christ at the great white throne judgment. And each of the things in the New Testament can be identified as either or one of those scenarios. However, the Olivet Discourse poses a little bit of a problem, and there's a reason for that. We're going to find out why it seems so difficult to parse. And so if you ask a futurist, for instance, about the Olivet Discourse, they will say that half of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew chapter 24, usually is what they're talking about, although it's also in Mark 13 and Luke 21. Most of them will say that half of chapter 24 in Matthew is about the Temple of Jerusalem and 70 AD, and they'll say the other half is about the future coming of Christ, okay? And even many partial preterists will kind of take that same approach. Now, full preterists will say that everything in Matthew 24 and the other renderings in the other Gospels of the Olivet Discourse are all about 70 AD. Well, I tend to disagree with both of those different views, and I will show you exactly why in this video. So let's get started looking into the Olivet Discourse. So first, what I'd like to do, of course, is just go to Matthew 24. That's usually the version of the Olivet Discourse that most people read, and so I think it's a good place to start. So let's go to Matthew 24 and just read it together. I'll try to be brief. So we'll just start in verse 1 and go through it. Jesus went out and departed from the temple. His disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said, "See ye not all these things? Verily I say to you, there shall not be here left one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." So, of course, Jesus here predicting the fall of the temple, which occurred in 70 AD. And he sat upon the Mount of Olives. The disciples came unto him privately, saying, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of thy coming and the end of the age?" The word world there in the English is from the Greek aeon, which means age, not really the world. So that's what the disciples asked. When would these things happen? Of course, Jesus had just mentioned the temple falling, being destroyed. And they ask, what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, we do have to remember here that the age that they could have been talking about was one of two things. It was either the Jewish age, which is what they were just coming out of. So they were asking, when does that end? The age we are in, when does it end? And when does this new age, essentially, of the kingdom start? They could also have been asking about the end of the kingdom age. Maybe they already understood that the kingdom had started because of what Christ had already told them, and they were thinking of the end of the age, meaning really the end of the world as it is rendered in the English. So that's an interesting either or that we're just not sure about. So as we read through the rest of the passage, we do have to kind of make guesses based on what is said and the context as to which one it is. Is it talking about the end of their age, the Jewish age, which would end with 70 AD, the end of the Jewish nation, so to speak? Or are they talking about something further out in the future? So that's really the question we're answering here. So let's continue here in Matthew 24. Verse 4, and Jesus answered and said to them, this is his answers to their questions. Take heed that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Now, of course, when he says end there, he's likely referring to the same end that he mentioned in verse 3, where he says the end of the age. Okay? Verse 7, nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines, pestilences, and earthquakes in diverse places. All of these things are the beginning of the sorrows. Now, realize that up to this point, verses 4 through 8, all of this has been things that we've verified in history that definitely occurred between the time that Christ told them this and 70 AD. So we realize that there were many false Christs during this time period, or false prophets in general. People claiming to have some word from the Father or some information about Messiah, or claiming to be the Messiah and then leading many people astray. It was something Josephus wrote about. Then there were definitely wars and rumors of wars during this time period. This time period was kind of marked by that. A lot of different scuffles and battles in different places between different armies, specifically the Roman armies and different nations around the world. And then it says nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There was this type of thing happening during this time period as well, just as we said, many wars. And there were also, as it says, famines, pestilences, and earthquakes during this time period. We have recorded incidents of all of these things. This doesn't necessarily make it so that it must be the time period between this discourse and 70 AD, but that time period so far fits very well with what has been said so far. So let's continue with verse 9. They shall deliver you up to be afflicted and shall kill you. You will be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And so if Christ is talking to his disciples here, it's definitely true that they were hated, and many of them, if not most of them, were killed even before 70 AD. The only one that we know of that did not seem to have been killed before 70 AD was John. There was mention in a couple early church fathers' writings that he was seen around 90 AD. He was very, very old and decrepit at the time, but he was still alive at that time. Verse 10, and then many shall be offended and betray one another and hate one another. Many false prophets rise and deceive many. Because iniquity shall abound, the love of many will wax cold. But he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness to all nations. And then the end shall come. So it mentions the offense of people betraying one another, false prophets, iniquity, and encourages them to endure to the end of whatever time period he's talking about. And then he mentions in verse 14, the gospel would be preached to all the world for all nations. And that actually did happen. We have that recorded not only in the book of Acts at Pentecost. That is the event where the Holy Spirit came down and allowed the gospel to be preached to men from all nations at the same time. And then, of course, they took the gospel back to their home states and nations. But we also have the writings of Paul, where in Romans he tells us that the gospel had already gone out to all nations at the time of the writing of those books, apparently referring back to Pentecost, saying that already happened. The word, the gospel, has gone out to all nations. So we know that this definitely happened within the time period between the giving of the Olivet Discourse and 70 AD. Now verse 15, when you therefore see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe to them that are with child, to them that give suck in those days. And pray that your flight is not in winter or on the Sabbath. For there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world till this time, nor ever shall be. Now, it mentions the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now, that is a phrase that is used in modern Christianity, but I think to most people's detriment, because all it simply means in the book of Daniel, when it says that there would be an abomination that makes desolate, it's talking about the desolation of the temple. We have identified, of course, in other studies that Daniel is referring specifically to the time of Christ, and even up into the judgment of Israel in 70 AD. That's exactly what's being described in the book of Daniel in chapter 9. And so the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet here is definitely the Roman armies coming into Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. In fact, the cross-reference for this verse in Luke 21 says exactly that when you see Jerusalem encompassed with armies, that you should then flee. It's the same statements, just rendered differently by the different writers. So we know that the abomination of desolation occurred in 70 AD, and that this is a reference to what happened at that time. Verse 22 continues about this tribulational period. Now, tribulation just means difficulty, distress. It's not a proper noun for some particular event, but in this case, it does mean something specific. It's talking about the distress that came before 70 AD. So it says, except those days be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. Kind of making the point here that this time period, God will not allow it to continue and continue, because if he did, all the, quote, elect would be killed. And the word elect is often used as a reference, especially in Jewish writings, as a reference to the Jewish people, his chosen people. The word elect, even in the Greek, means selected ones, the set apart ones, the ones that are chosen. So in that sense, and in a Jewish context, that is the Jewish people, the Jewish nation. In verse 23, then if any man says to you, lo, here is Christ, or there he is, believe it not. And he continues in the next few verses to talk about if people are saying that Christ exists, he's over here, he's over there, don't believe it. Okay, many, again, false prophets or false Christs in this time period. Verse 27, he says, for as lightning comes out of the east and shines to the west, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now this, again, is an interesting reference, because so far we haven't heard much at all about the coming of Christ. Realize that this is the first mention that Christ makes of his coming. Whereas we did see the disciples ask about that. This is the first time he said anything about him coming, okay, himself coming. He says that his coming would be like lightning that zaps across the sky. That's what his coming would be like. So let's commit that to our memory and keep going. He says, for wherever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. Now that's an interesting statement and doesn't actually make a lot of sense in the context here. So let's take note of that, just that's a anomalous kind of verse. It's hard to understand exactly what that verse means. He says, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon not give the light, and stars will fall from heaven. The powers of heaven will be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. And the tribes of the earth will mourn. They shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. All right, this is the second mention of the coming of the Son of Man, or Christ. He says that his sign would appear in heaven, and all the tribes of earth would mourn, and they would see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, I want to just make the point here that when it says all the tribes of earth will mourn, now the word tribes here is the same words in Greek that is generally translated as nations. Essentially, it's saying that every nation will see the Son of Man, will see Christ when he comes in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Now, the point I want to make is that all those things, the ways that that is talking about his coming, is very similar to many of the passages in the early church writings that are talking about his coming at the great white throne judgment. So now I want you just to realize that here in Matthew 24, we've seen him talking about his coming, and it's couched in the middle of the context of a 70 AD event. And now in verse 30, he says things about his, quote, coming in the clouds with power and glory, and all the nations of the earth seeing him. This sounds more like a great white throne event. Again, that phraseology, the verbiage of that is exactly like it is in the early Christian writings when it comes to the great white throne judgment at the end of time, at the end of earth's history, before the final judgment and the remaking of heaven and earth. So just be aware again, there seems to be two things being talked about here. And it does seem strange. It seems like it should be the same thing, right? There shouldn't be two different things being talked about in this passage at the same time. So keep that in your head, and let's continue as we finish Matthew 24 here. It says, he will send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet. They shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. Verse 32, now learn the parable of the fig tree. When the branch is yet tender and puts its leaves forth, you know that summer is near. So likewise, when you see these things, know it is near, at the doors. Verily I say unto you, in verse 34, this generation shall not pass till all these things be fulfilled. Now, again, another call out. This verse, of course, is super important to preterism. And it's because they say, when you read this verse, it means all the things that were just talked about, every single thing, including this stuff that sounds like the great white throne judgment coming, and the stuff that sounds like 70 AD coming. The preterists will say that that means all of it happened, okay? And it was all fulfilled. So just be aware that that is the way that they interpret this passage. Now, I want you to be able to reserve your judgment until we finish here with what we're going to do in this video, because we may be able to come to a bit of a different understanding here. But stick with me, because it's not as apparent as it first seems on the surface, okay? Verse 35, he says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour knows no man, not the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in those days before the flood they were eating and drinking, marrying, until the day Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. Now this narrative about Noah and his days is given so that you would recognize that the coming that's being talked about in these verses would be sudden, and it was unknown. The date of it, the timing of it, was unknown even by the angels of heaven. And so it would take everybody by surprise. Verse 40, 2 will be in the field, one will be taken, the other left. 2 women grinding at the mill, one taken, the other left. Watch therefore, for you know not what hour your Lord does come. But know this, that if the good man of the house had known in what watch the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken up. In this verse, the context is saying that the good man of the house is Satan. It's Satan, the one that is the prince of this world. If he had known that the thief would come, meaning Christ would come, because Christ came and stole from Satan those who were bound in Hades, it's saying that if Satan had known that Christ was coming and that he was who he said he was, that he would have watched and not allowed his house, meaning Hades, to be broken up. Okay, that's what this verse means. We're going to find this in another place in the scripture in just a second. Therefore it says, be ready, for in such an hour as you think not, the Son of Man comes. Who then is a faithful and wise servant who his Lord has made ruler over his household to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant whom his Lord, when he comes, shall find so doing. Verily I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. So it's talking about, in parable form, a servant who makes the most of this time period before the Lord comes will be rewarded for it. It says that if the evil servant says in his heart, my Lord delays his coming, and begins to smite his fellow servants and eat and drink with the drunken, becoming wicked, that the Lord of the servant will come in a day when he looks not for him, in an hour he's not aware of, and cut him asunder, and appoint his portion with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now again, the weeping and gnashing of teeth is another thing that is usually associated with the great white throne judgment. It is the punishment given to those who are wicked when he comes to judge everyone at the end. But again, all these verses, even these parable verses, talking about the surprising nature of his coming, that it will take everyone by surprise, and that you would want to stay righteous before he comes. Because if you go onto the dark side, you go wicked, and are not watching for the Lord's coming, then you would be taken unaware and will be counted among the wicked. So that's the end of Matthew 24's version of the Olivet Discourse. It's the most well-known version. As you can see, we saw a few things in there that are questionable, that we need to dig deeper on to understand more. We saw two different types of comings being mentioned. It seems in the first part of the chapter, it was more about 70 AD. It was obvious that it was, because some of the things that it was talking about that Christ prophesied, we know happened in or before 70 AD. Whereas at the end, it seemed to use a lot of phraseology that was reminiscent of the Great White Throne judgment texts in the early Christian writings. And so we have to ask ourselves, maybe there's a little more behind the surface we need to uncover. We don't want to go so far as to say right now, without studying the other parallel passages, we don't want to say, well, there's two different comings being talked about. And we also don't want to just blanket say everything is the same coming, even though it sounds different. It's all the same thing and it already happened. Those are, to me, both mistakes. So we're going to dig deeper now. So now that we've seen Matthew 24 and that version of the Olivet Discourse, the most well-known version, let's dig deeper. And the way we're going to do that is with something I've actually built already on the website that you can go to if you want. And I will have the link for this page we're going to go to in the description of the video. But here on my website, and right now it's on the most recent updates, this first link called the Olivet Discourse. Now it's also in my research pages. So under topics for research, if you scroll down, it is under there at right here, Olivet Discourse. So if we click into that, what I've got on this page is a parallel account of each of the versions of the Olivet Discourse. On the left-hand column is Matthew 24. As you scroll down, you can read through. In the middle column is Mark 13. In the right-hand column is Luke 21. So the sections that are parallel and synonymous are side by side. You can see how the slight variations, but they are very synonymous. Whereas other parts, there will be sections where something might not exist in one of the columns, but it does in the other. So those sections, you can see which accounts added or took away from the narrative of this story and how they changed it. So what I want to do is to go down here and notice that there were a couple things. And remember, the left-hand column is Matthew 24. If we scroll down here, I want to show you that, for instance, when we get to verses 26, 27, and 28, now this is one of the main sections that was actually one of the things that I said sounded like Great White Throne judgment instead of a 70 AD coming, which was Christ coming in the clouds, so to speak, in judgment against the nations. That isn't what we heard in verses 26 through 28 in Matthew 24. But as you can see here in red, and I have it in red because as I looked and read through this says, "Wherefore, if they shall say, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning comes out of the east and shines to the west, also shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." For one, verse 27, when it says Christ's coming would be like lightning shooting across the sky. That verse in Matthew 24 is not found in Mark 13 or Luke 21, either of the other Olivet Discourse narratives. However, in the book of Luke, it is found in chapter 17, a few chapters earlier than the Olivet Discourse, as part of a totally different discussion. So you can imagine what I thought when I found this out and realized that these verses in Matthew 24 that are supposedly a part of the Olivet Discourse in Luke 17 are not at all a part of the Olivet Discourse. And in fact, they're part of a totally different narrative. So again, this is one of the mentions of the coming of the Son of Man. Again, like I said, it's one that sounds more like a great white throne judgment coming than it does a 70 AD coming. So continuing down, there's another section that's like this. And it's when it gets to the section where we read, it talks about Noah. And it says, "As the days of Noah were, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days were before the flood, they ate and drank and were marrying, and they didn't know until the flood came." They were totally caught off guard by the flood. Even the verses 40 and 41 that say there will be two in the field and one will be taken, the other left. Two women grinding at the mill, one is taken, the other left. You'll notice that this passage doesn't appear at all in Luke or in Mark, in those accounts of the Olivet Discourse. And so this whole passage that's talking again about the coming of the Son of Man is actually only cross-referenced in Luke chapter 17 again. So it's just very interesting that both these parts of Matthew 24 that seem to sound like great white throne judgment comings at the end of Earth's history, comings at the final judgment, that these passages are actually not in the other parallel accounts of the Olivet Discourse. And they are included instead in a totally different narrative in Luke chapter 17. There's another couple sections that are also out of Luke, different areas of Luke, but these are actually out of Luke chapter 12. So verse 43 and 44, where it talked about the good man of the house and the thief. Of course, I do know that parable is talking about Satan trying to protect his property here on earth and in Hades, but Christ coming and stealing that away from him is what it's talking about, but that is out of Luke chapter 12. Again, it's not a part of either of the other accounts in Mark or Luke of the Olivet Discourse at all. Again, verse 44 saying, "Therefore be ready, because you don't know what hour the Son of Man comes." This also is not in the other Olivet Discourse narratives. And then all of verses 45 through 51 in Matthew are also not included in Mark or the Luke account of the Olivet Discourse. However, they are found in Luke chapter 12, verses 42 through 46. Which this talks about, again, the other parables that are seeming to talk about the quickness and the surprise nature of his coming. Again, this takes out a whole chunk of text out of Matthew 24 that sounds like it's talking about the coming of Christ. And of course, couched inside Matthew 24 sounds like it could be talking about 70 AD as well, but it is not a part of that narrative. And I would like to point out, in each of these cases of these segments of Matthew 24 that are not found in the other Olivet Discourse accounts, you need to realize that Matthew was not the earliest account of the Olivet Discourse. The oldest account of the Olivet Discourse was the Mark account in Mark 13. So the Mark 13 account, for all intents and purposes, could be the most accurate account. And then, of course, Luke is always seen as one, because he's a physician, that probably wrote with a detailed scrutiny, that possibly because of his physician status, he was a more detailed historian, so to speak, and that his account may have been more accurate in some cases. So when we compare those to Matthew, actually, we would be more apt to believe that both Mark and Luke are more accurate, perhaps, and more ancient than the book of Matthew. Most scholars think Matthew was compiled in about 80 or 90 AD, and the Gospel of Luke being about the same time as the book of Matthew. So really, Mark is the earliest record we have of the Olivet Discourse. So it probably would behoove us to look at the Olivet Discourse from Mark's perspective and see if it shifts our understanding just a little bit. So I would like next to read through the Mark version of the Olivet Discourse. Now I'm going to go fast. I'm not going to stop. I'm just going to read through it. It's a little shorter than Matthew's version. And what I want you to do is listen with me as I read it, or go through it yourself with me, and try to get the tone of it, and whether you think it talks about 70 AD or if it talks about something else, okay? And also take note of the mentions of his coming and how they are treated in this account of the Olivet Discourse versus the one we read in Matthew. Where in Matthew we saw some things that seemed like 70 AD, and then a lot of talk about his imminent coming like lightning, taking the world by surprise, and then every nation seeing him. Just consider the way that Mark is going to talk about the coming, or the next time period that is being prophesied. So let's read here in Mark 13, starting with verse 1. Again, I'll go kind of fast and just read through this. As he went out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Master, see what manner of stones and buildings are here." And Jesus said, "See these great buildings? There will not be one stone left upon another that won't be thrown down." As he sat upon the Mount of Olives over against the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign when all these things shall be fulfilled?" Now, recognize there, just quickly before we continue, the question is different than what was said in Matthew. In Matthew, they asked, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" In this account, an older account from Mark, he just says, the disciples only ask, "When will these things be, and what will be the sign when they will be fulfilled?" It's quite different. Verse 5, "And Jesus answering them began to say, 'Take heed lest any man deceive you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and will deceive many. And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, be not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in diverse places, famines, and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows. But take heed to yourselves, for they shall deliver you up to councils, and in the synagogues you will be beaten, and brought before rulers and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them. And the gospel must first be published among all nations. But when they shall lead you and deliver you up, take no thought beforehand what you will speak, but whatever shall be given to you in that hour by the Holy Ghost. Now the brother shall betray the brother to death, and the father the son. Children will rise up against their parents, and cause them to be put to death. And ye shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But he that endures to the end, the same shall be saved. Now, recognize again that up until now, all these verses, from verse 6 all the way to verse 13, every single thing that's talked about, being delivered up and beaten and killed in the synagogues, the gospel being published to all nations, pestilence, wars, earthquakes, nation against nation, Everything, again, is being very specific, and every single thing is a 70 AD occurrence that we know of in history. In verse 14, he says again what Matthew said, but also what Luke says about the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. When you see that, he says, let them that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him on the housetop not even go down to the house or enter therein to take anything out. Let him that is in the field not turn back again for his garments. But woe to them that are with child and to those that give suck in those days. And pray that your flight is not in winter. The same things said in Matthew, but again, all of these are 70 AD occurrences and seem to be referencing that event when Roman armies would come into the city of Jerusalem and oppress the Jewish people. Verse 19, for in those days shall be affliction, as was not since the beginning of creation, which God created until this time, neither shall there be. And except that the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, whom he has chosen, he has shortened the days. And if any man says to you, lo, here is Christ, or there he is, believe him not, for false Christs and prophets will rise. But take ye heed, behold, I have foretold you all things. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give her light, the stars of heaven will fall, the powers in heaven will be shaken, and they, meaning the powers that are shaken, shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. Again, all of these things seem to be references to 70 AD. The tribulation of those days, of course, both the Christian Jews and the Christian Gentiles saw great tribulation from the Romans. Nero himself led a persecution against the Christians specifically during this time period. And then we do have in history that the sun was darkened, the moon did not give light on various days during this time period. The stars of heaven in many cases, and the powers being shaken. It's talking about angelic powers, and that they would see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. In fact, this passage doesn't even claim that humans would see Christ coming in the clouds, but it claims that the powers of heaven would see him coming in the clouds. And then he shall send angels and gather together his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost parts of the earth to the uttermost part of heaven. Now that's an interesting statement too. He gathers his elect, the selected ones, from the uttermost parts of the earth. Now this generally in prophecy and in scriptural references is talking about Hades. It's called the uttermost parts of the earth because it's underground, it's out of sight, it's far away. And then the uttermost part of heaven. So what he's saying here is he would gather his elect from the four winds, from Hades and from heaven. A very different narrative than we are used to thinking about when it comes to the Olivet Discourse. But again, it plays in with a 70 AD view of this passage versus a end of the earth, final judgment, great white throne view of this passage. Verse 28, now learn the parable of the fig tree. When her branch is tender and puts forth leaves, you know that the summer is near. So in like manner you will see these things come to pass. Know that it's nigh, even at the doors. Verily I say to you that this generation will not pass till all these things be done. Now this statement, again, it is in parallel with what was said in the book of Matthew, chapter 24. However, like I'd said, this statement in the context of its passage, this account of the Olivet Discourse, makes more sense. Everything seems cohesive. It seems to be singularly talking about 70 AD and the events surrounding that time. So when it says that this generation will not pass till all these things be done, we can take it at its word for sure, because all the things described were 70 AD occurrences up to this point in Mark chapter 13. It says, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. Now this is actually just a kind of way of Christ saying that his words were not going to pass away. His words were true. He just said, verily I say to you, this generation will not pass till these things are done. And now he's saying, my words are not going to pass away. It would be more likely that heaven and earth would pass away before my words do, because they will come to pass. He's not telling them that heaven and earth are going to pass away in the context of the events he's talking about. This is a figure of speech. Verse 32, but of that day and hour knows no man, not the angels in heaven, nor the Son, nor the Father. Take heed, watch and pray, for you know not when the time is. So he's telling them that they will not know when this is going to happen. He's not going to tell them the day and the hour. This is, of course, 40 years before 70 AD occurs. So Christ is giving them foreknowledge, but not the time frame. Okay, so he's saying, watch and pray. He says in verse 34, for the Son of Man is as a man taking a far journey, who left his house and gave authority to his servants, to every man his work, and commanded the porter to watch. Watch ye therefore, for you know not when the master of the house comes, at evening, or midnight, or at the cock crow, or in the morning, lest coming suddenly he finds you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch. Now, you'll notice that as we read that passage, every single thing sounded and felt like the time period they were in. There was nothing that said anything about every eye seeing Christ when he came, or him coming with a power and glory, or his angels in heaven. All of those things are not in this earlier rendering of the Olivet Discourse that's in Mark chapter 13. So I hope that gives you a little perspective now on what we read in Matthew 24. It's quite different, and it gives a completely different tone. Again, I believe this entire passage is very concentrated on the time between Christ's giving of the Olivet Discourse to his disciples and the time of 70 AD. And everything here fits. Unlike in Matthew 24, there were some sections that felt like what I've read in the early Christian writings about the Great White Throne, and even in other passages in the New Testament that talk about the Great White Throne judgment. And again, we can go into those in my other video that will be upcoming. But I hope you see the differences here between Mark chapter 13's version, the earlier version of the Olivet Discourse, versus Matthew 24. All right, so now you've seen the major difference between the Mark version of the Olivet Discourse and the Matthew version of the Olivet Discourse. And that parts of Matthew 24 are actually taken from or parallel Luke chapters 12 and chapter 17 with totally different narratives that are being talked about. But what I want you to see now is we're going to go back to, and I'll show it on the screen, the parallel page that shows all three of these together, because I just want you to see that the Luke 21 version also kind of mirrors the Mark version and not the Matthew 24 version of the Olivet Discourse. So you'll just see as we scroll down through here a little bit, for instance, at the beginning about the destruction of the temple and the disciples asking him the questions. It's all very similar to Mark and Matthew. Matthew, again, is on the left, Mark in the middle, and Luke on the right. It stays the same as he talks about many false Christs coming and the wars and rumors of wars, nations against nations, earthquakes, etc. Then about the persecutions that the disciples would endure. And note here that in the section that says that the gospel would be preached to all nations. Now the Matthew version over here on the left is very short. That's about all it says. The gospel would be preached to all nations, and then shall the end come. Well, it's interesting that neither of the other passages says, then shall the end come. That's not in the Mark version or the Luke version. And in fact, they add to this section, both Mark and Luke add parts about the disciples going, and when they're before officials, that God would give them the words to speak, that the Holy Spirit would guide them. that they would also be betrayed and hated by people. But just note that stuff, the guidance for the disciples, which seems to be a natural part of Christ's answer about the coming time period, is left out of the Matthew 24 version, but it is both in the Mark and the Luke version. The abomination of desolation is mentioned in all three versions. And the warnings about the vengeance of these days in Luke is different a little bit than either of the other versions, but it also includes the warnings about fleeing Judea when the armies are compassed with around Jerusalem. After verse 24, it says, "And they shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations." It's talking about the Jewish people. And it says Jerusalem will be trodden down by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now you'll see as we continue, though, when the other passages talk about the false Christ, Luke is silent on that completely. It had already mentioned it up above, but these extra sections, Luke does not mention those. And again, the passages in Matthew that were from Luke chapter 17 or 12, those are not repeated in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse at all, obviously, because Luke already recorded those when they occurred earlier on in Jesus' other speeches. It mentions the sun, the moon, and the stars giving signs, the distress of nations, the powers of heaven being shaken, and then them seeing the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and glory, just as Mark said, and actually Matthew repeats that as well. It also includes the parable of the fig tree in the Lucan version. And then again, it skips the sections from Luke 17. And interestingly enough, it skips the section that talks about that no man knows the day or the hour when the Son of Man would come except the Father. Now the Luke version then, verses 34 through 36, which says to take heed and don't be overcome with wickedness, and to be waiting and watching. Watch ye therefore and pray always. And it finishes the chapter just by saying that in the day he was teaching at the temple, and at the night he went to the Mount of Olives, and all the people came early in the morning to see him. But that's it. And you see now that the Luke version, and if you just take the Luke version, and we're not going to do it, we're not going to read through it obviously together, but if you read through the Luke version, you will feel the same way as when you read the Mark version of the Olivet Discourse. That it really is couching everything in 70 AD, that's all it's talking about. Unlike the Matthew version, there's nothing that sounds like the Great White Throne Judgment. There's nothing that talks much about the coming of Christ, except that it says that he may be seen coming in the clouds with power and glory. Okay? And that it was all centered around the time of when the abomination of desolation would come into the city and people should flee. So that should clarify our view of each of these passages. Now, as far as conclusions, when I did this study, I came away from this feeling like this was my main conclusion. And if, your view of scriptures is that they're inerrant in some very literary fashion, and that there's nothing that's wrong with the Bible, so to speak, and that even though the accounts of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are totally different in their own ways, that they're all equally perfect. If you have a view like that, you're not going to like what I say next. But my feeling on this after reading Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21, and finding that Matthew had pieces of Luke chapter 12 and pieces of Luke chapter 17 sprinkled into the narrative of the Olivet Discourse, I feel like the versions of Mark chapter 13 and Luke chapter 21 of the Olivet Discourse are the more accurate versions. And that Matthew 24's was compiled, and it was done so probably a little later on than the other versions, and that it was compiled incorrectly. Some portions of it obviously were taken from different accounts given by Christ at different times, and those accounts did not necessarily relate to 70 AD. However, that is very clear when you go to Mark 13 and read the narrative there of the Olivet Discourse, or if you go to Luke 21 and read that narrative of the Olivet Discourse. Those two passages are very clear that this is all about the time frame between about 30 AD and 70 AD. And it talks about all the things that happened during that time period. The wars, the rumors of wars, nations against nations, pestilences, earthquakes. And all of this is accounted for in history. We have records from multiple historians that record these different things during this time period. Of course, ending up with exactly what was prophesied by the writings of Daniel and these passages, the abomination of desolation, where the Roman armies came into the city and into the temple, and they desolated it. They desecrated it, but desolated it, meaning it was made of no use any longer. And just as Christ said in these passages, no stone was left on another. The temple was burnt and then knocked down to the ground afterwards by the Roman armies. In fact, they did that with about a third of the city or more, maybe half of the city. They knocked it down completely. So I hope that makes sense to you. And that is definitely my opinion, that Mark 13 and Luke 21 are the more accurate representations of the Olivet Discourse. And that Matthew 24, while it has some accurate parts, it also has some additions that were made by adding in things from other passages that perhaps the persons that compiled it thought were relevant. Maybe they thought those passages were the same events being talked about, but yet they were not. It was a different narrative. In fact, some of those other references that were pulled in were about the Great White Throne judgment. And you're going to see that in the next video when I go through those references with you. And we see how each of them are very consistent with the Great White Throne judgment events, but not so much with the 70 AD events. The Olivet Discourse was all about 70 AD, 100%. And just as Christ said in those passages in Mark 13 and in Luke 21, those people he was talking to, the disciples, they saw these things fulfilled in their generation. So this resolves all the conflicts and all the inconsistencies by understanding that the Mark version is likely the most accurate, along with the Luke version, and that the Matthew version is a compilation of different speeches by Christ. So I hope that this helps you in your study and clears up the Olivet Discourse. This should help futurists if they would understand that these different versions are important to understand, and would recognize what Mark 13 and Luke 21 are actually doing with this passage, instead of relying on the Matthew 24 version. Then I think that would help futurists clear up their eschatology. And it would also help preterists, full preterists particularly, clear up their eschatology by understanding that the Olivet Discourse was all about 70 AD. But some of those statements about the coming of Christ, about every eye seeing him, and some of those Great White Throne judgment sayings, they are not part of this narrative. So thank you for taking the time with me today. I hope this does help you, and God bless you in your study. Thanks.